Fans and followers, good afternoon. Here we have a guest, an exceptional guest today. It is our dear friend Rob Atkinson. Rob not only is a dear friend, but he's one of the most renowned and famous technology strategists in the US. He chairs a very important think tank based in Washington, D.C., ITIF, Information Technology Innovation Foundation, which is funded by the most important technology companies in the US, and is dialogue with the federal government in DC on issues of technology, trade, industrial policy, development, economy, and ITIF is a very important point of discussion and reflection about what the U.S. should be doing, what the world should be doing, what the Western world should be doing. And Rob recently has written an article saying, calling for a G2 in technology between Europe and the US, and to face the powerful rise of China in the technology field, trying to tackle and check the dominance, the increasing dominance of Chinese technology. It's a very good paper that we would like to discuss with you today. And he raised very important point. Basically, Rob makes a very blunt point. Europe should no hesitation, no middle ground. Europe and US should join together, pull together their technology strength to face the Chinese challenge and threat. But now I would like Rob to explain his thoughts to us, and then we have a little bit of discussion. Thank you, Rob.
So, Alberto, it's great to see you again. I've long enjoyed our relationship, and Fabio, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I think one of the biggest, I was listening yesterday, there was a 2-day podcast or conference by the Peterson Institute of International Economics here in Washington. And they had this big conference. I think the World Bank or the IMF, one of these annual things this year. So everybody's in town, Europeans and other people from all around the world. And I was listening to a bunch of these panels, and they basically were saying two things, really. When you boil everything down, they're saying two things. Number one, it doesn't matter what your industrial structure is. So there's a famous line by Michael Boskin, who used to be the chief economic advisor for President Bush, the first President Bush. And he famously said, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? That's what economists believe. They really, really, really believe that. And the second thing they believe is that markets are the best thing, and therefore, why do we even have national borders? I mean, national borders are just, they allow these these rubes, these economic ignoramuses who don't really know economics to do things like put on tariffs. So the reason I say that is that, and this is certainly true in Europe, but also true in the US, in their ideal world, in the world they live in, China's not a threat. If China takes over aerospace, telecommunications equipment, AI, it doesn't really matter because we'll do something else. We'll be really good at farming. And secondly, they don't believe that industrial policy works. So everything China's doing to dominate these global industries, they think it's not only worthless, but harmful. And why that's so dangerous is we have to build a consensus that and Alberto, you know this, you've been in China, you know exactly what they're doing. They have a long-term strategy to not just win, but to dominate every advanced industry in the world. So they would be happy to get rid of Airbus and Boeing. That's what they want to do.
Absolutely.
They want to do the same thing in semiconductors, starting with memory. They want to do this. They're making that big play in telecom equipment. And the only reason Ericsson and Nokia would have gone out of business if it hadn't been for the Trump administration sort of forcing countries to not buy Nokia, not buy Huawei or ZTE. So we have to come to the realization that this is the biggest threat the West has ever faced from a techno-economic perspective. And unfortunately, I don't see the European leadership there. I don't see the American leadership, but there's a second problem in Europe, and I'll just stop there. The second problem in Europe is that the elite leaders and thought leaders and others, they see the challenge from China and the US as equal. They actually look at us as sort of an equal challenger in the same camp, because, oh my God, we did the IRA and we funded some clean energy. That to me is beyond belief that a serious European official can put us in the same category as China when it comes to techno-economic threat. We have $1 trillion trade deficit. $1 trillion. Explain to me why we're a threat. So that's what this piece was all about, calling for a G2, essentially, was to say, look, it's time for Europe and the US to build a very strong alliance, working together to build up our advanced technology industries more and to push back against the Chinese. And there's lots of ways we could push back against the Chinese efforts if we were serious.
Fabio, your turn.
No, there is definitely a misunderstanding in Europe, and also policymakers are in denial. I've written a book which is called Millennium Theft, detailing all the operation perpetrated by China to steal intellectual property, to spy on institutions, universities, think tank, to steal industrial secrets, to conduct hybrid war against the Western democracies. So the awareness, or better to say, lack thereof, among policymakers in Europe, Italy in particular, is stunning. They stick their head under the sand because they don't want to see, because seeing, acknowledging means taking action. And in Europe, taking action is a taboo. They want the easy life, they want the nice chit chat, they want to be friends with everybody, be it Iran, be it Venezuela, be it Russia, be it China. When any controversy arises, there is a reaction, or I would say an attitude of total ignorance, in the sense that they want to ignore what the problem might be, so that they can eschew their responsibilities. With China, it's obvious. With Russia, it's even more obvious, because the Putin strategy against the Western values, not even Western, let's say, democracy, Western countries, Western economies, started long ago, intensified in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and Donbass, and was not met with any substantial reaction by the Western countries. And even now, the sanctions imposed on Russia are a joke. They're not enforced. Banks are free to do whatever. Russian banks are free to do whatever they want. So the number one emergency, I would say, is to spread awareness And as you rightfully said, I mean, economists, but I would say certain economists think that markets exist in a vacuum. They don't understand that markets rely on a set of rules. And if you have within a market somebody who does not abide to those rules, the market collapses. And that's what happened when we meaning the Western economies, and I include in that definition Japan, Australia, South Korea, I would say the OECD countries, to be more specific. When we let China inside the market, we did not bother to set rules that could be enforceable. And the WTO is not an institution capable of enforcing those rules. So the Chinese took advantage of the absence of enforceable rules and conducted a ruthless campaign against Western economies, Western values, Western democracy, which now belatedly we became aware. Actually, to Trump's credit, we must say that he was the first one to change the paradigm, because before Trump, free trade issues were never mixed with geopolitical issues. They would run on parallel tracks. So nobody would, unless in exceptional cases like Iran or I don't know other let's say rogue states, the commercial sanctions were never brought in discussion on geopolitical issues. It was presumed that the free trade was on a higher level beyond anything else. It was Trump who said, no, trade is the issue, or at least one of the main issues. But so what do you think in practice we can do as Western economies, Western democracies, in terms of stronger cooperation? Because, for example, there was a proposal of a free trade agreement between the EU and the US, and that has gone nowhere. So it would have been
Prestowitz proposal.
This
is
who?
Clyde Prestowitz proposal.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that hasn't gone anywhere. So how can we set the policy agenda on the right track, in your opinion?
Well, Fabio, I 100% agree with everything you said. And I'll answer your question in just one second. I have to say, I think the biggest challenge is exactly what you said. It's so comfortable. You go to Italy, you go out and you have your little glass of wine, your beautiful thing, olive oil, and everybody's happy. Same thing in the rest of Europe. And there's this European hubris that it's the Americans who are the imperialists, and why are we stirring things up? And it's, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Europe's from Venus, man. Let's get along with everybody. And it's built into this sort of self-conception of why Europe is superior. And it's, as you said, head in the sand. So the first important thing is we have to realize there's going to be a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, a lot of disruption for us to be able to start going and taking the steps we need to take. What do we need to do? Well, Alberto, you mentioned, I think you mentioned the Clyde Prestowitz, a sort of longtime sort of advocate of industrial strategy. Clyde and I wrote an article in the Washington Post a few years ago, and we called for a NATO for trade. And what we meant by that was, I'll talk a little bit about why I don't think the WTO works anymore. We weren't talking about replacing, getting a new WTO, although we need to do that. What we were talking about was in NATO, is it Article 6? What's the one that is mutual defense?
Article 5, mutual support in case of aggression.
We need to have a NATO for trade in the sense of China is super smart. They pick they don't attack, they never fight a two-front war. They always go after one country at a time. They went after Australia. They went after, I think, Estonia. And we got to basically say together, no, we're not going to stand for that. You cannot use commercial and technological aggression to kowtow, to make these countries kowtow to Beijing. So that's number one. We got to stand together. And yeah, that's going to piss off the Chinese. So what? Because if we all work together, they can't do anything against us. They can't attack, German firms, because if they attack German firms, we're all going to get together. Number two, the WTO cannot succeed against China because the WTO is, first of all, China's on the WTO, they veto everything. Secondly, the WTO is based upon you have to be able to show the written rules. You have to be able to show here's the administrative law history. Chinese are incredibly they're not naive. They know the WTO rules better than the WTO. We just have to create an alternative to the WTO, which should be based on Europe and the US, probably the Japanese, the Canadians, the Brits, but a new trading organization that does not let the Chinese in, and frankly, wouldn't let the Indians in for a long while. And in that world, it's going to be rules-based and enforceable. And that would free up the rest, this group, if you will, this free trading group, to begin to impose real sanctions, real penalties on the Chinese, which cannot be done under the WTO regime. That's what we need to do. The other thing we need to do is we need to, like Europe, they're talking about maybe there should be some EV tariffs. Like, no kidding, really. Why is that even a debate? BYD, the car company, I just saw the numbers. I forget what there's a new study that just came out on that by a really good German think tank, Merix, I think it is. $2.5 billion of subsidies to one company. You know how much Huawei has received in subsidies? $70 billion. So, you know how open our markets are? The Chinese just announced something last week where they said the telecom companies in China Mobile and others, after I think 6 months, no more Intel chips or AMD chips allowed in their networks. So we should say, fine, no more. We're never going to buy a Chinese chip. We shouldn't allow Chinese heavy construction equipment to be sold in our markets because they don't allow our equipment to be sold there. So I think the other thing we have to do is we have to basically put in import bans on firms that are systematically cheating. Not just a few tariffs here and there, but import bans in the US, we can do that for a 10-year period. We need to do that together. The other thing we need to do is we need to have much more collaboration. We just did a big study on Chinese robotics. Unbelievable how much progress they're making in robotics. I mean, the Germans in the Swiss, they'll be gone in 10 years in terms of being robot leaders. The Chinese will become the world leaders in robotics. You know how many European firms, Chinese robotic firms have bought? I mean, why would you allow a single European firm to be bought by a Chinese firm? It's insane. And now, Brussels is trying to they've come up with this sort of equivalent of what we call CFIUS, but it's not enforceable. So you get the Hungarians, oh yeah, sure, you can buy our firm, just give us a bunch of money. So we got to stop the Chinese from buying our advanced firms, and we got to do that collectively. And there's a lot more things we could talk about, but I think there's a whole bunch of things we could do right now.
Alberto, you want to chip in?
Rob, what do you think of the whole situation with the EV? Now, we think it's dramatic, the whole thing of the Chinese EV flooding into the market and taking over. What is your view on that issue from a US perspective?
Well, I can tell you sort of what I think the U.S. will do, and then but let me start by saying what I think the perspective is. I was listening to a panel. There's a group called the Center for Automotive Research in Michigan, great group, and they were doing a whole panel on Chinese EVs. Somebody made this point. It blew my mind, but they were experts and they said this. Every year, there's an average of 3 big auto ship carriers. So big ships designed not to carry containers, but to carry ships. The last year, there were 30 that were under order, 30, because the Chinese are buying up massive numbers of auto ship carriers. Why are they doing that, you may ask? Well, because they plan to export an enormous array of electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles, by the way, how did the Chinese get their electric vehicles? Well, if you were Ford or I assume Volkswagen, the same thing, if you wanted to sell your electric vehicle in China and then get that little credit where the consumer would get a credit or the ability to drive on the road with an electric vehicle, if you wanted your vehicle to qualify, you had to share your EV technology with the Chinese. Come on, what the heck? Well, how would we even allow that? And then on top of that, as I mentioned, these massive subsidies. So the US and the Chinese and the Europeans should work together, and we should say, sorry, for a period of time, we're not going to allow any Chinese EVs to be sold. The other advantage the Chinese have, and it's an advantage that in some ways is good, in other ways, if the market were evolving normally, the EV market would be really earlier. And the only reason the EVs advanced so much in China is they forced, through coercion, people to buy EVs. Alberto, you've been to Beijing. If you want to drive on one of those roads, without paying an enormous amount of fees and stuff, and you just have an EV. Your plate says EV, and so all the Chinese consumers are like, man, I'm buying an EV. I get to drive on the freeway to work in the morning. We're not going to do that, and I hope we don't do that kind of thing in the West, because it's, consumers should get to pick what they want. So they just got this huge advantage, this sort of early stage advantage. And I think if we let them in right now, they've gained that advantage before the Volkswagens of the world, before the Fords of the world have been able to really mature and catch up. I think it's just going to decimate the industry. So at least a 10-year timeout. Let our car companies catch up and be able to compete more effectively. And then if there are then you should have tariffs or countervailing duties based upon the amount of subsidy. So that's what I would do.
If you put tariffs or you ban the import of Chinese vehicles, would you allow Chinese to invest in EV factories in the US?
So this is a really...
Or in Mexico, which is linked to the US by the free trade agreement.
Right. I wish I had a really good answer to that, because it's an issue that I've been thinking a lot about. I think ultimately we're going to have to do that. So I think, Alberto, you remember, and Fabio, you remember the 80s and 90s with the Japanese challenge, and
absolutely,
the sort of agreement was, hey, if you don't build your car factories here, we're gonna put a tariff on them, or we'll have import limits. And the METI in Japan realized they could read the handwriting on the wall, and they went to Toyota and Nissan and Subaru and everybody. You got to go build some factories. And by the way, they were really smart about it. They basically built factories in different states so they could get as many Senate votes as possible. Great strategy, really smart. I think ultimately we're going to have something similar to China. They're just going to be too big. They're going to be they're going to have so many. I think we're ultimately going to say, if you want to sell here, you have to build a greenfield factory here. But I wouldn't do it right away because I think, again, they've got this unfair lead that I think we got to at least let our producers catch up.
But go ahead, Alberto. I don't know if you want to.
You go ahead.
Now, there is an issue which is broader. And the issue of subsidies goes beyond the unfair trade practices. The Chinese economy is running on subsidies, concessional loans, and other forms of support by the government. But this support is becoming unsustainable from the fiscal point of view. Because I don't know if you've seen the projection by the IMF, official projection by the IMF, by my former colleagues, on the true debt, public debt of China. Okay, so including not only the central government, but also the provincial governments, all the funds, all the entities directly linked to the to the government in Beijing. Now we're talking about 160% of GDP in a matter of few years by the end of this decade. And in a few years, it will be 150%.
Hold on.
I can send you the. I can send you
Fabio,
the
for some reason, I'm having a harder time hearing.
Okay. You want me to repeat?
Let me see here.
This is the Chinese Secret Service
Okay, try
that is
that again.
disrupting
Sorry.
our communications. But we'll build a resilient.
Sorry, I'm having a
connection.
hard time hearing what's going on.
Let's see if we can solve the. Alberto, you hear me well, right?
Yes.
I wonder if I should log out and log back in. Was that going to mess everything up?
No, not at all. Go ahead, try. We will come back in a few seconds. Okay, go ahead, go. Okay, so we're back. Puts our cybersecurity in place to counter this hacking by the Chinese Minister of State Security. So what I was saying, Rob, is that the amount of subsidies granted by the Chinese government to the industrial sector is becoming a global problem. China is a loose cannon because they build overcapacity in all sort of industrial sectors, and they're dumping this overcapacity on the global markets. But in doing so, they are accumulating a huge government debt. It's like a company. China is like a company that is producing at a loss. They're trying to recoup that loss by lowering the prices on international and domestic markets, hence the deflation. But this is a suicidal strategy because my former colleagues at the IMF estimate that the Chinese public debt, the total Chinese public debt, including provincial governments, central government, funds, and all public entities, will reach 160% by the end of this decade. So it's on an unsustainable path. And so China risks to be a global source of instability, a loose cannon for everybody, not only in the Western economies, but also in emerging economies, because Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, India, they're all feeling the impact of these export dumping by China, and this can only intensify as time goes by. So it's paradoxically, we are supporting with free trade the suicidal strategy of China. And when ultimately China will be bankrupt, we will have to bear the consequences of that bankruptcy on international markets. So it will be the mother of all sovereign bankruptcies. And I'm not sure that anybody is aware of what can happen, not in the distant future, within a few years.
So I am not a financial economist. I'm a sort of real economy economist. So I obviously not my strength. But if I had to pick a country that's going to default first, it'd probably be the US. We are completely incapable of cutting spending, completely incapable of raising taxes. But to your point, Fabio, I do think there's a bunch of Achilles heels that the Chinese have, and this is one of them. But at the same time, two things. One, they don't rely just on subsidies to their advantage. They rely on RMB manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
They rely on closing off their market to us, where our firms could then gain some scale. And as you know, most economists don't think this, but a lot of these industries are high fixed cost, low marginal cost industries. So when you cut off their most profitable at the end of the tail sales, it really hurts them. Thirdly, the Chinese do have the power to continue to immiserate their working class and just, they can move money around. They can do all these things. So, I think that actually, to me, so I don't disagree with you, but I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in the West. Oh, the Chinese are going to fall apart because of their demography. Chinese will fall apart because they've moved towards state-owned enterprises. They have this fiscal. Maybe. I don't want to bet my kid's future on that.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. But I'm saying that the future in the next few years might be affected by these unfair trade practices.
I agree.
In the more distant future will be affected by the collapse of China's financial system and public finance.
Yeah. I know you're not saying that, or Alberto is saying that, but it's so striking in the U.S. I work on near Massachusetts Avenue, and if you come to D.C., Massachusetts Avenue is home to all of these globalist, free trading, international think tanks, who all they do now is they say, "Don't worry about China. It's a dead horse. It's not going to be able to do anything. It's got all these problems," and they do it for the simple reason is they do not want to have any disruption of their global ideological nirvana world. And secondly, they do not want the U.S. to adopt a techno-economic strategy because that goes against their free trade ideology. So I worry that the narrative in DC is now, we don't really need to worry too much about China because they're falling apart. And yet you go and you look, we're doing a big study that'll be out in the fall looking at 10 advanced industries in China and how well they're doing: robotics, chemicals, semiconductors, nuclear power, space exploration, biopharmaceuticals, AI, quantum. It is scary. That's all I can say. What we're finding, it's scary. They're way ahead of where people think they are, and they're making faster progress than we think they are. So I agree. There's certainly, there's lots of different ways that the whole China thing could fall apart, but I think we should do our job to help that along and not just keep our fingers crossed.
But so what would you do? What would be your 3, 4, 5 key recommendation if you were to address the decision makers, the policy makers on both sides of the Atlantic? What would you tell them?
Yeah. So number one would be, we as a group So basically the G3, if you will, Japan, Europe, the US, and then I put the UK in there, maybe as a G3.5. We will no longer tolerate Chinese policies of picking us off one against another. Last year, I was in a meeting in the White House where we were talking about the Chinese ban on Micron memory chips. Now, why did China do that? Because they want to have more memory chips? Sure. The reason they did that is because Micron made a mistake by raising their hand and complaining about all the BS and unfair policies in China that were hurting Micron. The CCP then said, oh, if you're going to do that, we will put a gun to your head, we will pull the trigger. So I said to the White House, I said, this is a red line in the sand. If you allow this to happen, so my response to the White House when in this meeting, and there were like 8 of us at the meeting, I said, look, if they do this and they don't back off for negotiation, no more Chinese televisions ever imported to the US. Chinese imported an enormous number of televisions to the US. Fine, you want to do that? We'll do that, tit for tat. They didn't do it. So now what has China done? Last week, as I said, no more AMD and Intel chips in their telecom sector. So first thing I would do would be to say, we all have to work together and we have to tell the Chinese, you cannot retaliate against our companies. If we bring a trade case against you and you try retaliating against them, we'll bring 3 trade cases. We'll ban your imports. So number 1 is stand up to their aggression. Number 2 is systematically go through and identify the industries where they're competing in a systematically unfair way. Look, we all subsidize a bit, but if you look at European subsidies or US subsidies, they're 0.3%.
Yeah, they're marginal.
They're marginal. The Chinese is like, so fine. If we identify industries where you're doing that, you cannot sell into our market. End of story. Third, we have to punish the Chinese for intellectual property theft. We know it's happening, and we refuse to do anything. And then finally, we need to have a joint, serious advanced industry strategy to promote and support our own advanced industries working together. And that was one of the points of my article, is it really is time for Europe to get over its inferiority complex and stop talking about digital sovereignty and the American techno-imperialists. Give me a break. That's not where the challenge is. Get over that. Let's figure out how we can build a giant integrated automobile market, a drug market, aerospace. If I were Airbus, I'd be super worried right now because of COMAX subsidies. So stop worrying, stop complaining about Boeing and vice versa. Let's work together. And so I think that's what we really have to do. I'm not optimistic that we're going to do it, but I think that's what we should do.
Rob, a few years ago, in 2018, it was pre-COVID, you and I signed a notarized long-term bet. Do you remember that?
I do. I think I'm going to win.
I think you're going to win. You basically said that the U.S. productivity will go up to 2.5%, something like that. I don't remember exactly the term, but you forecast a very high productivity increase for the U.S. It was the long term. Now, at that time, there was no hype about AI. There was no hype. But when you signed that bet with me, did you have AI in mind? What did you have in mind?
No, I had AI in mind.
Betting on AI?
Yeah, among other things, I think autonomous systems, robotics, which are AI enabled, and I think. But Alberto, if I made that bet now, I might not make that bet because. 2 reasons why. One is I think AI is overhyped. I can do a really great. We've got this new book coming out in May 7th. It's called Technology, Fears, and Scapegoats: 40 Myths About the Innovation Economy. And we designed a cover ourselves, this beautiful cover, which the publisher decided not to use. They used another one we don't like. But we didn't need an artist to do that. We just did it ourselves. It took us 2 minutes. but that's pretty narrow kind of stuff. So number one, I think AI is maybe going to be less than people think. But secondly, and more importantly, we don't have a real strategy for boosting productivity in the US. We have a tax law that Trump pushed in 2018, and among its provisions, which has now expired, was the ability for companies to expense for tax purposes machinery and equipment. So you buy a new machine, you can write it off in the first year as opposed to amortize it over 8 or 12. That's gone away because, you know, the Democrats think that's corporate welfare. So we don't really have a policy in the US to think about productivity. If you think about what the current administration is doing, it's all equity, it's all redistribution, it's all fairness. They actually have a narrative. That's one of the 40 myths in our book. One of the myths is that productivity no longer helps American workers. That now has become the narrative. And when you go through it and you compare, you have to use, Fabio, you're an economist, you know, you have to use the same deflator for the consumption as the production. You know, you have to include non-wage compensation, you know. When you do all that, it's pretty close, you know, productivity and wages. The problem is we haven't had high productivity. So the center left and the left, and actually now some on the right in the US, have basically given up on productivity. Well, we better just do redistribute. We'll make the rich pay more. I'm happy to have the rich pay more, but that's not going to solve a lot of problems. So I'm more worried, Alberto, because I think our policies now are not even supportive of productivity. They're sort of antagonistic towards productivity. And the EU is even worse. I mean, if you look at the EU regulatory morass on new technologies coming out of Brussels, geez, it's going to be even harder for the EU, I would argue.
Yeah, I totally agree.
No, but this issue that you just pointed out in terms of identity of views between left and certain parts of the conservatives is evident in Italy as well. We moved in a matter of a few years from an extreme left government to now an extreme right government on paper. When you look at economic policies, they are identical. Maybe the left emphasizes more the small craftsmen or the small and medium-sized enterprises in I don't know, ONG, let's say. And the right emphasizes the agribusiness or taxi drivers. The principles are exactly the same. Corporatist, I don't know how to say in English, narrow-minded. Productivity is not an issue.
Yeah.
The little guy needs the government support, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So you look at, my last book was a book called Big is Beautiful. You've seen the book, Alberto. Big is Beautiful.
Yeah, Big is Beautiful.
Debunking the Myth of Small Business. It was MIT Press. And you look at Europe, this is data from the European Commission, and you look at the productivity of small businesses, medium, large, it's a linear line. The small businesses are the least productive, and the large businesses are the most productive. It's true in the US, it's true in Europe. And the narrative in Europe is even worse than the US. The narrative in Europe is like insane. It's like, well, the European economy is a small business economy, therefore we should support small business. Europeans' problem is that it's a small business economy. It needs bigger firms. Like there was one study that John Van Reenen at London School of Economics did of France. They found that there was a disproportionately large number of French firms that had 49 employees. Because once you hit 50,
yeah, you can fire.
High taxes, unions, regulations, but keep it 49. So 100% agree, Fabio. The right and the left have to, they got to, it's ridiculous. If we don't figure out how to raise productivity in Europe and the US, we're in deep, deep trouble.
You see, productivity itself is a bad word. Sorry, Albert, just to productivity in Italy, it's a bad word. It's like the F word. Seriously, because what they have in mind, you know, when you talk about productivity, is that people must work more for lower wages. That's what have been,
Yeah.
you know, reiterated over and over for decades, and people come to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea that you must raise productivity in order to raise living standard, wages, innovation, standard of living is totally incomprehensible to people because they've been brainwashed for decades, not for years, not for months, for
Yeah. Yeah.
decades.
Yeah. Same in the U.S. Same in the U.S. But so I have a, I live U.S. lots of houses. So I live in the suburbs. We have a little house, and I mow the lawn, but I use the scissors because I don't want to raise productivity. I wouldn't want to use a lawnmower. Give me a break. There's a great quote by Paul Krugman,
Yeah.
the famous economist,
Yeah.
and he says productivity is the most important thing in any economy. But we're not going to talk about it because economists know nothing about how to raise productivity. So when
Yeah.
you listen to a lot of economists, they'll say it's really important, but what do you do? And then when you listen to politicians, they're like, oh, productivity is just a way to speed up work. Both are wrong. You can raise, there are lots of ways to think about raising productivity. And the evidence is so crystal clear that productivity leads to reduced work hours in the long run, and it leads to higher wages.
By the way, another line of argument against productivity is that the resources of the earth are limited, so we are consuming all these resources. If we increase productivity, we're depleting the natural resources of our wonderful planet, and therefore will destroy humanity, will destroy the nature, will destroy everything, because you cannot raise, production beyond limits.
So I wrote an article for a journal called The Independent Review, and it was called The Decline of the West. No, it was called the abandonment of productivity and the decline of the West. And I addressed that argument there. And here's my answer to that, Fabio.
Yeah.
I think I agree with that, and therefore, under no circumstances, I do not want Africa or India to raise their living standards at all. It's unrealistic, unfair for them. How dare they try to become middle class? I don't want that. I want them to stay super dirt poor. Really? The elite class is going to say that? But to a more serious point, the more money we have, the more productivity we have, the more likely it is we're going to be able to afford cleaner technologies. We'll invest more in cleaner technologies. We'll invest in materials innovation. The planet will be so much better off if we could raise productivity, because we're just going to have more resources to address these problems. And ultimately, imagine if we could develop fusion technology. Energy problem is solved for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So, and you can't do that without putting a boatload of money into it. And you get the boatload of money from having countries with more money from productivity.
Yeah.
Alberto, up to you.
No, I think I don't want to abuse of Rob. There is something I want to say to Rob off the record. So I think let's stop here and let's take 3 minutes with Rob without being recorded.
Off records. Okay, then, Rob, thanks very much for your comments, for having accepted our invitation. We will put a link in the description to your book, to the book forthcoming on May 7th. And once again, we want to remind our viewers, please subscribe to this channel, move your little hand and click on the like icon. You will help us to be more visible to YouTube algorithm, And so you will help us to be more effective at spreading this conversation, these ideas, these arguments more globally. Thanks a lot, Rob. All the
Don't hang
best.
up, Rob. Don't hang up.
No, I won't. Alberto, Fabio, this was fantastic. Love the conversation. Happy to do it again. This was
Likewise.
great.
We
Likewise.
loved having
We'll
you. Listen, Rob, Fab,